Text message came in at 11:37 on a Tuesday night while I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, still in my scrubs, eating a granola bar for dinner. We've talked it over. You're no longer welcome in this family. Don't contact us. My mother sent it. I know her typing style, no contractions, period, at the end of every sentence like she's filing a report. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the follow-up. The apology. The apology? The I didn't mean that. Something. Instead, my brother's name appeared at the top of my screen. He'd reacted to the message with a thumbs up, a thumbs up. I set my phone face down on the passenger seat and finished my granola bar. Outside, the parking garage hummed with the sound of a distant ventilation system. 2 floors below, the ER was probably still running at full capacity. Somewhere in there, my colleagues were managing chaos, keeping people alive, making split-second decisions under fluorescent lights. I picked up my phone again. I'd been a financial analyst for 6 years. My entire job was risk assessment, identifying exposure, building contingency models, protecting assets before the damage became irreversible. My parents had called that skill set cold for years. My mother once told a relative that I was too calculating to be warm. Fine, then I be calculating. I opened my laptop bag on the passenger seat and pulled out my work MacBook. I had the passwords to everything, not because my family trusted me, but because I was the one who set it all up. The streaming subscriptions, the family phone plan, the security system at the house on Birchwood Drive, the Amazon household account. My father, Roger, used to order everything from lawn fertilizer to his blood pressure supplements because he'd never once figured out how to create his own. I started with the phone plan. All 4 lines, mine. My parents, my brother Tanner's, were under my name. My credit, my account. I'd added them when my father retired and said he couldn't justify the expense. That was 4 years ago. He'd never offered to take the account over. I'd never pushed it. I removed his line first, then my mother's, Sandra, then Tanner's. I transferred my own line to a new individual plan. The whole process took 11 minutes. They wouldn't notice until morning when their phones showed no service and they tried to figure out why. Next was the Amazon household. I removed them as members, changed the primary email, and updated the payment method to a card they didn't have access to. There were 3 subscribe and save orders set to ship Friday. Roger's fish oil, Sandra's specialty face wash, a case of sparkling water my brother had added without asking. I canceled all 3. I sat back against the headrest. There was one more thing. The thing I'd been paying for so long that I'd stopped thinking of it as a choice. My parents' supplemental dental and vision insurance, a $97 auto-drafted from my checking account since 2021, when Roger said the plan through his retirement wasn't cutting it and asked if I could float it for a little while. 41 months. I'd paid $7,667 in premiums for their dental and vision coverage and had never once been reimbursed a single dollar. I didn't cancel the policy. Canceling would trigger an immediate notification letter to their home address. Instead, I navigated to the billing section and deleted my bank account from the payment methods. I left the field blank. The next draft date was 18 days away. They would have no idea until the coverage quietly lapsed, and Sandra went in for her annual eye exam and the optometrist's office told her the insurance had been terminated for non-payment. I called it a controlled shutdown. I drove home. I made tea. I did not cry. I want to explain something because I know how this sounds. I know people are reading this thinking your family disowned you and your first reaction was to cancel their phone plan, and maybe that seems cold. But you have to understand that I didn't get there overnight. Nobody does. My name is Lydia. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked fine from the outside. Nice lawn, seasonal wreath on the door. The kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other from their driveways. My father worked in insurance. My mother ran a small bookkeeping business from home. By the time I was in high school, I understood without anyone saying it directly that money was tight. The house was remortgaged. The credit cards were carrying balances. There were arguments behind closed doors that stopped the moment I came downstairs. Tanner was 4 years younger than me and somehow exempt from all of it. I don't mean that bitterly. Or at least I've tried to let go of the bitterness. But it was true. When Tanner wanted to play travel baseball, the fees were found. When I asked about a debate camp the summer before junior year, my mother said we'd see, and we never saw. When Tanner needed a car at 17, my father co-signed a loan. When I needed a car at 17, my father told me I should own financial responsibility and suggested I save up. I got a scholarship to Ohio State. Full ride plus a small stipend. My parents acted like it was the expected outcome. There was no celebration dinner. My mother said, "Well, that's a relief," and went back to her crossword. I graduated with honors. Got a job at a mid-sized consulting firm in Columbus. Within 2 years, I was making more money than both my parents combined, and that, I think, is when things shifted. Not openly, not dramatically, just quietly, incrementally, the way a tide comes in. My father's first ask was the phone plan. He framed it as temporary. My mother's first ask was the dental insurance. She framed it as just until things stabilize. Tanner's first ask was $3,000 for a security deposit on an apartment, which he said he'd pay back within a few months. That was 3 years ago. I kept a spreadsheet, not to be vindictive. I kept it because I was an analyst and tracking numbers was how my brain made sense of the world. The total, as of the night I sat in that parking garage, was $41,340. Phone bills, insurance premiums, the security deposit. A cash transfer when my parents' furnace died in February 2 years ago. A loan to Tanner for a car repair, grocery deliveries I'd set up for my mother during a winter when her back was bad. $41,340. And not once, not one single time, had anyone said thank you. Not in a card, not in a text, not in passing. The money moved from my account to their needs and was absorbed without acknowledgement, like water into dry ground. The morning after the text, I was up before 6. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my phone face up, watching the notifications come in. 9 missed calls from my mother, 4 from my father, 2 voicemails from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Tanner calling from a neighbor's phone because his cell service had been disconnected. I listened to my father's voicemail first. Lydia. His voice had that particular flatness he used when he was trying to sound in control. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this stops now. You restore those services by noon, or I'm calling your company's HR department. I'll tell them you've been stealing client data. I'll tell them you're unstable." You think you're so smart? We'll see how smart you are when you're unemployed. I played it twice. Then I forwarded it to my personal email and saved the audio file to my cloud storage with a file name that included the date and timestamp. Then I called my manager, Jess, before she got to the office. "I need to tell you something," I said, "before you potentially get a call from someone claiming to be my family. I have documentation of financial harassment and now a verbal threat against my employment. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Jess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Send me everything." I did. Here's what they didn't know. I hadn't been passive for the past 6 years. I'd been patient. There's a difference. Passive means you accept the situation. Patient means you're waiting for the moment when the math changes. My grandmother, my father's mother, had died 14 months earlier. Her name was Evelyn, and she was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. She'd come to my college graduation. She'd mailed me a card on my work anniversary every year when I visited her in the memory care facility where she spent her last 2 years. She would hold my hand and say, "You got out. Good girl. Don't let them pull you back." I hadn't known what she meant by out. I thought she meant Columbus, the suburb, the smallness of it. I didn't understand until her attorney called me 6 weeks after she passed. She'd left me her investment portfolio, $280,000, diversified across index funds and municipal bonds, managed by a fiduciary she'd trusted for 20 years. She'd updated the beneficiary designation quietly without telling anyone 3 years before she died. My father had expected to inherit it. He was her only child. He'd been counting on it. I know this because I'd overheard him on the phone with someone around the time of her diagnosis, talking about what comes next with a casualness that made me feel sick. The attorney handling Evelyn's estate had contacted my parents as a courtesy, since they were next of kin. My father found out about the inheritance before I did. I know this because, looking back, I can now trace the exact timeline of when his behavior toward me shifted from dismissive to suddenly, inexplicably warm. There were 2 months in there where he asked how my job was going, remembered my birthday without my mother prompting him, called me kiddo, the way he had when I was small. He'd been softening me up. The text, the disownment, came 8 days after I told him gently but clearly that I wouldn't be contributing the inheritance to the family's finances, that I was keeping it, that I'd be using it to buy my own place. We've talked it over. You're no longer welcome in this family. Don't contact us. The thumbs up from Tanner. I understood then. I wasn't their daughter. I was their funding source. The moment I indicated the funding was stopping, I was reclassified. I spent a Saturday 2 weeks after the text, doing something that might sound strange. I went to a thrift store and bought the most forgettable outfit I could find. A shapeless beige cardigan. Loose khaki pants. The kind of thing someone's aunt wears to a church potluck. I tried it on in front of my bedroom mirror and practiced looking smaller. Shoulders rounded. Eyes down, hands slightly unsteady. A tremor in my voice when I spoke. My family had a fixed image of me. In their version, I was anxious, easily overwhelmed, not quite as capable as I thought I was. My mother had said as recently as last Thanksgiving that she worried I took on too much. My father had questioned whether I was really suited for the senior analyst track. They'd built this version of me over years and believed in it completely. I was going to use it. My father's mother, my grandmother Evelyn, had a financial advisor named Mr. Caldwell who had managed her estate for 17 years. After she passed, he'd agreed to stay on as executor until the inheritance transfer was complete. I called him and explained what I expected to happen at the family meeting I was about to request. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen this before. Here's what we can do." I called my mother and said I wanted to meet. I said I was confused and scared and didn't know what had happened to our family. I said I missed them. I let my voice crack. She agreed to a meeting at Birchwood Drive that Sunday at 2 o'clock. I arrived in the beige cardigan. I hadn't slept, which made the shadows under my eyes look real enough. I sat in the chair by the window, the one that always made me feel 12 years old, and I folded my hands in my lap. My father sat across from me like he was presiding over a negotiation he'd already won. My mother sat beside him, her posture precise, her expression the specific one she wore when she wanted to appear reasonable. Tanner was on the couch, scrolling his phone, looking up occasionally the way a bored audience member might check to see if the show was almost over. "You've put us in a very difficult position," my father began. I looked at the floor and nodded. "Your grandmother's money," he continued, "really should stay in the family, in a shared account, for stability." I let my chin wobble. I said, "I just don't know what to do. I don't understand finances the way you do." My mother leaned forward. "We would manage it for you," she said. "We'd set up an account. You'd have access." I looked up at her with what I hoped read as desperate gratitude. I said, "Could we get that in writing, so I know I'm protected?" My father didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. Mr. Caldwell had drawn up a document. It was 3 pages, and it looked to a layperson like a standard family financial agreement, the kind of thing you might sign without reading too carefully if you were in a hurry or if you trusted the person who handed it to you. What it actually said, buried in the second page under a section titled Asset Management Terms, was that any party who attempted to exercise control over the inherited funds without the named beneficiary's explicit written consent would be considered to have formally renounced any claim to those funds or to any future inheritance from the same estate line. Evelyn had been the kind of woman who planned. She'd updated her will 6 months before she died to include a provision if any family member attempted to pressure, manipulate, or legally contest the inheritance. Her remaining charitable bequests, a small amount she'd set aside for a local literacy organization, would redirect to an irrevocable trust in my name instead. She'd seen it coming. She'd built a moat around me before she left. My father signed the document without reading past the first paragraph. My mother signed it. Tanner, when my mother called him over from the couch, signed it because my father told him to. I watched their hands move the pen across the paper. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. The way you feel when a long equation finally resolves. Not excitement, just the clean finality of a correct answer. I folded my copy of the document, put it in my bag, and stood up. "I'm sorry," I said, and let the beige cardigan do its work one last time. "I need a little time to think about all of this. I'll be in touch." My father was already talking about where he'd put the money when I closed the front door behind me. The call came from Mr. Caldwell's office 4 days later, after the document had been reviewed by both parties' counsel. My family had retained one, finally, after Tanner apparently Googled something and got nervous. The attorney reviewed the asset management clause. He reviewed the will provision. He reviewed the redirection of the charitable trust. He called my father, not me. I know this because my father called me approximately 40 minutes after that, and for the first time in my memory he sounded small. "Lydia," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." There hadn't been. The next few weeks were not dramatic. That's the part that surprises people when I tell this story. There was no screaming, no confrontation at a parking lot, no moment where I stood in a doorway and delivered a speech. Real endings aren't like that. Real endings are paperwork and unanswered calls and the specific silence of a phone that used to ring and doesn't anymore. My mother sent 2 emails. I read them both and responded to neither. My brother texted from his restored phone number. He'd apparently gotten a new plan asking if we could just talk. I didn't respond. My father left one more voicemail. His voice was controlled, but it had lost the certainty. He sounded like a man who had opened a door expecting a room and found there was no floor. I bought an apartment, a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood I liked. 12 minutes from my office with a balcony that got morning sun. I painted the kitchen a shade of green that my mother would have called a lot. I bought plants. I got a cat and named him after my grandmother's street, which I realize is strange, but it made me feel like something was carried forward. I found a therapist, which I'm not going to pretend was easy to admit I needed. I'd spent 6 years telling myself I was fine because I was functional. I showed up to work. I hit my numbers. I kept other people's lives running smoothly. Functional and fine are not the same thing. She helped me understand the difference. Here's what I want to say to anyone who's reading this and recognizing something. The people who use you don't announce it. They don't say, "I have decided to treat you as a resource rather than a person." They say, "Can you help with this, just this once?" And then once becomes always and always becomes expected, and expected becomes a character flaw if you object. They build a version of you that is just weak enough to need them and just capable enough to be useful, and they maintain it carefully because it serves them. The moment you stop serving them, you become the problem. I stopped serving them. I became the problem. And then I became free. My grandmother knew I would need a way out before I knew I needed one. She planned for it with the same quiet precision she'd applied to everything in her life. Her grocery lists, her garden beds, her Christmas cards sent every year without fail. Always arriving on the 23rd of December, never the 26th. She saw me when no one else was looking. She left me a door. I walked through it. If you are still in the middle of what I was in the middle of, still sending the money, still picking up the calls, still shrinking yourself to fit the space they've decided you belong in. I want you to hear this. The ledger you are keeping in your head is real. The exhaustion you are pretending not to feel is real. The version of yourself that existed before you started managing their lives is still there. You don't have to blow anything up. You don't have to make a speech. You just have to stop paying for something that was never actually yours to carry. Change the account, change the locks, and then go buy yourself a plant and let it get morning sun. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that living room on Birchwood Drive. Not the legal mechanics of it. I understood those before I walked in. I mean what happened underneath. My father signed that document because he had spent 30 years believing that confidence was the same thing as intelligence. He sat across from me in his good chair, in his Sunday posture, and he looked at his daughter in a shapeless beige cardigan, and he saw exactly what he'd always decided I was. He didn't read the document because he didn't think he needed to. That's not bad luck. That's consequence catching up to character. My grandmother Evelyn understood something that took me years to learn on my own, that the people who underestimate you are handing you an advantage every single time they do it. She'd watched my family for decades. She knew Roger's blind spots better than Roger did. She didn't leave me that money as a gift, or not only as a gift. She left it as a set of tools, and she trusted me to know how to use them. That trust meant more to me than the dollar amount. It still does. I think about what it took to get to that Sunday. Not the plan. The plan came together in a few weeks. I mean the years before the plan. The years of showing up to holidays where my contributions were invisible, of transferring money without being asked twice, because I already knew the answer if I said no. Of keeping a spreadsheet not out of resentment, but because tracking numbers was the only way I knew how to hold on to the truth of what was happening when everyone around me was rewriting it. That kind of endurance isn't glamorous. It doesn't make a good story while you're living it. It just looks like a woman eating a granola bar alone in a parking garage at midnight, being very still, deciding what comes next. What I know now is that integrity compounds. Not quickly and not visibly, but it does. Every year I kept my word to my employer, to my clients, to myself, with a year the gap widened between who I actually was and the version of me my family had decided to believe in. They froze me at 18. I kept growing. By the time we sat in that room together, we weren't the same distance from each other anymore. I was somewhere they couldn't reach. The hardest part wasn't the legal process or the silence after. The hardest part was accepting that the people who were supposed to see me never wanted to. That the warmth my father showed me in those 2 months before I said no to him, the kiddos and the birthday calls, wasn't a glimpse of who he could be. It was a tool. Recognizing that didn't make me hard. It made me honest. And honesty, I've found, is where the real rebuilding starts. You don't need a dramatic confrontation. You don't need a speech. You need to get clear on what is actually true, separate from what you've been told to believe about yourself. And then you need to act from that clarity consistently, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one is watching, even when the people who should be in your corner are the ones making it hardest. That's not a strategy. That's just the only way I know how to live now. My cat is asleep on the balcony. The kitchen is green. The morning sun comes in right on schedule. Evelyn would have approved.